record. Awesome, Jay. I am so excited to have you here today. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, what a pleasure. It's going to be fun, I think.
I think for those listening at home, Jay and I have already had the fitting privilege, the luxury, the energetic foreplay of the technical difficulties one might expect from such conversations of cosmic horror or maybe even just cosmic annoyance.
Yeah, I feel like we've been blessed by the gremlins. So
Yeah,
let's
the ribbon's been cut.
exactly. So let's go in that spirit, I think.
Yeah,
I love it.
absolutely. So as you know, I begin with each of these interviews. I really want to know, I really want to hear direct from you, from the horse's mouth, what is the monster to you? Monsters, monster, cosmological understanding, emotional understanding. Just how do you feel about it and what is it to you?
Yes. I mean, it's a great question because it kind of makes me think about lots of different aspects of myself, I suppose. I mean, the first thing that comes up for me is, it's interesting, but because I feel like there's a distinction in my mind between kind of what I find to be monstrous, what I find to be truly monstrous, and the monster,
Mm.
because what I find to be truly monstrous is often very much in the realm of the human world. But I think when I think about the monster, the abiding feeling that comes up for me, and perhaps a similar feeling comes up for you, Sasha, but it's affection, really. It's a
Mm.
kind of love, it's a kinship, it's a connection. And when I think about why that might be, I guess I think about essentially growing up, a weird brown kid, a mixed race kid in London in the 80s and 90s, and really wrestling with my own otherness and my own sense of who I was, just so people know, my father is Indian, first generation Indian, and came over to England in the 1960s. My mom is child of immigrants, second generation child of immigrants, daughter of a Polish Catholic and a Russian Jew. So I grew up with these very kind of mixed up heritages and felt like they all belonged to me and none of them belonged to me at the same
Mm.
time. And I also had this I think there's a specific thing that particularly mixed race people have sometimes, which is slightly different from the kind of second generation, both parents from, immigrated from the same country, where you don't really have a kind of rooted household culture. Often the immigrant family will come over and sort of replicate their home culture in the house, and that didn't really happen. And partly didn't happen because my parents were from different places, but it also partly didn't happen, I think, because my dad had his own conflicted relationship, I would say, with his upbringing and his inheritance. He rebelled in many ways, I think, against his kind of upper caste Indian background. Not that he suppressed in any way his Indianness or his brownness, he didn't, but there was always that slightly sort of schizophrenic, conflicted thing in him. So for me and my sister, it was like, for us, it was like, where the hell do we fit in?
Yeah.
Who am I? And that kind of wrestling with my own identity and otherness. And so I think because I was a sensitive kid, because I've spent a lot of time in the sort of imaginal spaces, and I was always reading and writing and watching things, and I was drawn towards the weird. I think that those stories really pulled me in, stories about the outside. I felt like an outsider in sort of every situation, in this deep way, in this way of not quite knowing what my inheritance really was. And so these stories of these creatures, these things from the outside that come and play with us really spoke to me, and I found myself, loving weird literature and loving weird movies, and those kind of figures became important to me. And so I think to circle back to the question of what do monsters mean to me, I would say I have a kind of double answer. I would give you a kind of double simultaneous answer, if you like.
Yeah.
It would be, on the one hand, on a sort of psychological level, I think I always felt that monsters psychologically, clearly for me they're like the externalization of everything that we feel othered in ourselves, everything that feels fearful and abject and weird about ourselves are projected outwards onto these figures of these monsters
Yeah.
come and scare us in the night. And of course, if you see that, if you come to understand that, how could you not have a bond of sort of affection? How could you not have a bond of love there? Because the monsters are us,
Yeah.
we're looking at a mirror of ourselves. So I think that there's truth to that psychological kind of interpretation, and I've learned from that. But I would also give my double answer would be I have a more mystical sense as well, a more mystical answer, if you like, which is that I think since I was a kid, I've always felt some part of me has always felt, well, these things are real, that they have a reality of their own. That the reality in which they exist is one that's just as real and tangible in some ways as this one, and it's coexistent with this reality. And I think I've always felt, I mean, at first this was intuitive. And I think over the years, as my life has become, professionally telling these kind of stories, I think it's become more and more conscious. But I've always felt that like what's happening when we're watching and reading these stories and definitely creating these stories is we're reaching into that other reality, and we're connecting with these things that are there, and we're trying through whatever facilities we have to translate those things, those connections, those stories into this reality. I think
Mm.
that's what the creative act is. So I would give you that's my double answer for you. There's a psychological thing, but there's something deeper to me about these things having a life of their own, and they're out there and we're speaking to them. That would be my answer, I think.
I love it. I mean, you swept me up in this sort of question now that I have to ask, even though I don't want to ask it. But it's so alive inside my brain now. It's like gnawing at it, barracuda. Like, do
Tell
we
me.
feel, do we feel that the monster can exist without otherness? Right? Like otherness being so integral to the definition, the tracing, the margins of the delineation, the taste of the monster, right? And the circumstances which allow the monster to be pointed at and called monster, right? Um, if we were to homogenize everything, if we were to eliminate the possibility of otherness, could we still have the monster?
What a lovely question. To me, it kind of points towards what maybe we'll talk about in a bit, and cosmic horror and
Mm-hmm.
the dissolution of the person into the other. But no, I think the answer to your question is no, because what happens when the other becomes absorbed, what happens when the self becomes dissolved into the other is the monster's neutralized. The fear is gone. The monster exists precisely, I think, in that tension between the one that feels themselves to be separate from the other, trying to face the other, trying to negotiate the other in some way. And with some monsters that might be a kind of bodily threat that the self is trying to avoid, and with some monsters that might be an even deeper kind of threat, a threat to the very structure of that self, that separate person. But whatever it is, that tension is where the monster exists. I think it's that tension between the self and the other. So no, I mean otherness and the monster, I think, are synonymous.
I totally I feel that and I agree with that. And it makes me think about how one of the things we've talked about in the context of films like, Event Horizon being a good example,
Yeah.
is how within cosmic horror in particular, there's this the way out is through mentality, right? Like one has to kind of surrender to whatever these alien entities are, becoming more loving or devotional or worshipful of them to be enlivened by that power as opposed to annihilated.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with cosmic horror is really an interesting one, I think. And it kind of it relates to, what you spoke about in your introduction, my interest in sort of nothingness with a big N, right?
Yeah.
Because, and I'll circle back, I'll sort of unpack this in a minute, but my feeling is cosmic horror is like it's so close to a spiritual realization. It's like what cosmic horror is, what we can talk about when we talk about a spiritual awakening, a spiritual realization, a Satori experience in Zen Buddhism. It's when the self becomes dissolved into everything and is revealed to be the big nothing, the big capital N nothing. And we'll talk about more about nothing in a second. And I think what happens in cosmic horror is the self, the person, the diligent student of Miskatonic University or whatever, is confronted by the big other, the massive, the vast, unknowable, and is kind of stuck in this place of feeling their mind and their selfhood being pulled apart by it, but not being able to resolve themselves into it. That it's kind of this suspended or aborted spiritual experience. And I think, yeah, what would happen if that person, that hapless kind of, little mind trying to comprehend the incomprehensible, what would happen if they let themselves dissolve, let themselves give the monster what it wants? Well, then the terror would be over. It no longer becomes horror, it's
Yeah.
just oneness, if you like. It's oneness with the thing, and the thing no longer is the thing. The thing is just everything. So I feel like that's to me that's the definition of cosmic horror, if you like. It's that again, it's that tension, it's that person, it's the separate mind trying to comprehend what just can't be kind of understood and unable to fall into them, unable to let go of that. And you're right, when it does, if it finally manages to, the horror's over. The monster is fulfilled, if you like. So I think that is in a way the key to cosmic horror, as opposed to other kinds of monsters. I think, a more grounded monster, whatever it might be, a werewolf or a vampire or a demon or a banshee or a spirit, they often have more kind of corporeal laws to them. That once you discover those laws, once you discover those keys, you can survive, or you can defeat the monster, or you can overcome the monster. I think with cosmic horror, it's much less easy to pin down. It's really about the self contemplating its own dissolution, which can be terrifying. That's the bad trip, right? That's the ego unable to let go. And that's where I think the horror, the sort of the nature of cosmic horror really lives for me.
I think that's so clever and that's so good because it reminds me of, for instance, say like In the Mouth of Madness, right? Where
Yeah.
we have the horrors beyond comprehension, and then we have a sort of like triangulation uh of what happens when they are comprehended, right?
Yeah.
And for some of the characters, it's madness and murder. For some of them, it's laughing up riotous, and for others, it's almost godlike. And so we see those almost as an equivalent of what really intense spiritual practice can provoke or invoke in an individual as well, right? When is it the horror, is the horror that we can comprehend enough to know that we are not comprehending nearly enough, right? Or is is it that critique people have of Lovecraft where they're like, this man basically was a coward and that's what his stories are about, right? Is that the capacity to always be afraid, to resist against the surrender, right? To always
Yeah.
allow otherness to be that shadow or that specter.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's not I mean, I think it's important to understand, that Lovecraft was, an incredibly, his kind of racism, his xenophobia was kind of like elevated to this almost bonkers spiritual level, and that's what we're feeling in in these stories. I think it is exactly what you said, the inability to ever surrender to the other. But yeah, I mean, I feel like I feel like yes, the horror of cosmic horror is the horror of hanging on desperately, not just to the mind. It's not just about, I think, the mind being pulled apart. I think it's actually good cosmic horror. It's even deeper than that. It's the horror of feeling your very selfhood, the structure of you as an individual self being threatened, you
Mm.
know. And yeah, it kind of, let's say in the Eastern traditions, for example, that is the border, the kind of threshold into, what I don't know, like a Zen practitioner might call a Satori experience, or an emptiness experience, or an enlightenment experience. Like, it's being able to go push past that threshold that always comes up in that kind of spiritual journey of fear of the dissolution of not just the mind, but of the self, the very structure of the self, is being to be able to push past that and see that's in that kind of tradition, that your selfhood was always an illusion to begin with, that there was always only the nothing, the big nothing. And that, in those kind of traditions, is the tipping into realization or spiritual, enlightenment, if you like. And I think, yeah, the cosmic, the narrator or the protagonist of the cosmic horror is stuck in that place, stuck at that threshold, if you like. And yeah, maybe some people get past it. Maybe some people survive by getting past it. But it's funny to think about. The other thing that I think a lot about cosmic horror is whether film can really do it. It is a really
Yeah.
good question, because I think there are films that have captured some of that vibe, some of the cosmic horror vibe, and we can maybe talk about some of those. And Mouth of Madness is a good one, and Carpenter has done it, I think, probably the best in
Mhm.
my opinion. And we can talk a little bit, because I think what happens in film is the the feeling of cosmic horror is conjured by films that might not even on the surface be kind of firmly situated in the genre, because what we're talking about, I think, with cosmic horror is precisely the person trying to comprehend the incomprehensible. And so the problem with film is that, and I speak as someone who began as a novelist and then spent, the last 20 years or so kind of in film and thinking about the differences between the two. What you have in literature, and why I think cosmic horror really properly belongs in literature, is you have the kind of squishiness of language.
Yeah.
Language point towards the ineffable. That's why Lovecraft uses all those, bonkers adjectives. That's why we've got, like, cyclopean geometries and entities. It's all to point towards something that can never be truly defined. It's all to point towards that which can't be conceived. And the horror is trying to conceive it. Whereas in film, what you've got, the whole process of putting a film together and figuring out a movie is that all you've really got is the concrete. You've got concrete imagery and action to portray your story and to portray your inner conflict. So you're always looking for a way to concretize things, to find the image, to find the action that can dramatize what you want to dramatize. And so, in a way, it's antithetical to the real power of cosmic horror. And I think because, cosmic horror doesn't deal in what can be concretized, and so I feel like when it happens in film, my theory about it is that cosmic horror, when it happens in film, happens through a kind of excess. It's always it's always kind of conjured by this sort of excessiveness of imagery that can sometimes border on kind of ridiculous,
Yeah.
or certainly grotesque. But it's often about the juxtaposition of the very real, the grittily real, and the totally upset, sort of excessive and crazy. And I think somewhere in that tension gets conjured sometimes the true feeling of cosmic horror. So I would make like I would make a case that The Thing, like Carpenter's The Thing, even though on its surface, I don't think it's really classically a cosmic horror. It's like a monster movie.
Yeah.
The creature feature, the story about a creature that's been unleashed, in a confined environment, and a bunch of guys have to survive it and overcome it somehow if they can. And that's a creature feature. But to me, what has always made that film, which is one of my favorite movies, a a kind of a cosmic horror, is that you have this weird juxtaposition between this super gritty, real depiction of this place and these people and this environment, down to, you can feel, you can smell these guys, you can, see,
Yeah.
you can sweat on their foreheads. And so you have this real gritties, and then when the thing is revealed, it's just bonkers. It's,
Yeah.
you almost can't believe what you're looking at. It's very easy to forget how crazy those effects were at the time and still are. Because I guess if you're a horror aficionado, if you like The Thing, and if you like those images have sort of become, almost tropes. I mean, we all, fans of it know the bit where he defibrillates the guy and then the guy's stomach opens into a giant maw and bites the guy's arms off. And then, the guy's head peels off his body and grows flesh-colored spider legs and scuttles away. But that stuff is so excessive and crazy. And of course, it's all done practically. So it has this
Yeah.
visceral that you're almost like, what am I watching here? You can't quite comprehend, especially as it's juxtaposed to a very real, very grounded, tense kind of environment. You kind of can't, or you almost can't comprehend it, I feel like. And I think that to me is a way that cinema can capture that vibe of what cosmic horror really is. And another thing about The Thing is, the thing itself, like the creatures or the entities in cosmic horror, can't really be defined. It doesn't really have a single body. It's more like this force of sort of flesh and will. It's like it's everywhere. It's alive in every bit of itself, and it's protean, and it's constantly moving and shifting, and it's dissolving itself into weird shapes, and melting dogs, and it's doing these crazy things, and you can never pin it down. So I feel like there are ways in which cinema can gesture towards or capture cosmic horror, but my feeling is like its true home is where it began in words, because words can point rather than show. That cinema has to show things in a way that words can avoid, can shimmy away from. Anyway, I went on a tangent about
No,
cosmic.
I love it. I love it so much. And I mean, I think you're right, because with length, capacity to speak around the thing, right?
Yeah.
Both the little the thing and capital the thing, right? We can allude to it. We can conjure or evoke the feelings, the sensations, the emotions provoked by something like this. We can play into and we can rather take for granted that each person has their own imaginal capacities, and they will bring into their own foyer of their imagination their own respective terrors that somehow color or code the thing. In cinema, I mean, I think a great example is how everyone was scared shitless when Signs came out until the alien like came on the screen, and everyone's like, that
Yeah, I
what?
mean, yeah, like, what, really? Yeah.
Yeah, you're
I mean,
that like, I waited, I was so scared. But that's the thing, right? About this, because cosmic horror is more about feeling an existential dread and annihilation of the ego self, and the pulling back of the veil of the Lacanian real to recognize, oh, there's so much out there that I have in order to live my life pretended doesn't exist, right? um it's
yeah,
hard to show that. It's hard to physically, materially show those things without them suddenly losing their power.
yeah, you can't. And look, this is a problem that all of us who have worked on scary things, scary movies, and any kind of scary movie, it's a problem that we always face, which is, if you show too much, it's no longer scary. if you show too much, then like you said, the ability of the audience to project their own fears into the shadows on the wall, into the suggestion of the creature, that's gone, and it's often a problem you see in horror films, especially when you have, too much of the creature. When you have the
Yeah.
creature walking around in broad daylight, suddenly the fear is gone. And I think the creators who are good at what they do know that, and we have to think about that all the time. How much do horror is so much about what you hold back.
Yeah.
And I do think that, like, things like CGI and the use of techniques which maybe technically are more quote unquote realistic, but that lack a certain physicality and viscerality are part of the problem too,
Yeah.
because it kind of takes you out of that human, somehow a prosthetic, even though it's fake, its fakeness allows you to project into it somehow, and when something is too uncannily real, it somehow loses its impact. So these are all things that, like, I feel like the horror creator has to think about all the time. How much of the monster do you show? And the great horror movies know not to show too much,
Pulls in this whole other idea of a dichotomized cosmic horror monster, the one that is uh take the original Alien, right, where you have a physical human being inside the costume of the monster acting the thing out, and because there's a real soul that's animating a form, it's imbued with all these sort of like possessory sensations, right? And then there's also, in its own way, maybe going into too much of like a metacritical level here, but the cosmic horror of the cosmic horror monster that is completely artificially designed within a computer via CGI, right? The totally post monster. I mean, when we start thinking about the fact that we can create these monsters that we can't see physically with our own eyes, we have to like build them through the computer into a scene, and the actor is actually responding to nothing, and having to act against nothing. I mean, I'm a big practical effect person, so I don't want this to seem
Me too.
otherwise. But it started tripping me out a little bit to think about the respective and otherwise horrors too of something that is completely digitally developed, and how that leads into a lot of the cosmic horror cinema we see featuring like a synthetic human, like an android or cyborg character, right?
Yeah, you're right that in a way there's an overlap between the kind of, AI supermind that has escaped the bounds, the physical bounds of kind of material reality, and has found a way to kind of become omniscient, become godlike, is terrifying. I mean, terrifying in kind of interesting ways, because it reminds me a little bit of, it's the terror of the thing that seems or has begins human. I mean, that's the terror of the android, the thing that looks human but isn't, that has this absence inside of it. And that can bring us on actually to think about the monster of the psychopath or the sociopath. And I feel like, the psychopath writ large, the triumph of materiality is maybe the computer mind, the all-powerful computer mind. And you're right, it kind of overlaps then with the unknowableness of the cosmic other, or the cosmic monster. I mean, I feel like where the cosmic monster really lives, the real terror of the cosmic monster is in its unthinkability. It's in its inconceivability.
Yeah.
Beyond our tiny, puny human mind's ability to conceptualize it, And again, then we're also there adjacent to these kind of Eastern traditional understandings of what true nature, true reality is. We're back towards nothingness, and I think that's a really interesting tension there, because I mean, for example, I would just read just before this, I was looking at Nagarjuna, who's a great Buddhist philosopher, second century philosopher, who was very big on emptiness, and kind of 2000 years ago or so was was using logic, basically, was using, the language of logic to essentially, exquisitely argue that you can't point towards any inherent reality to anything, right? And of course, now, in terms of science and the cutting edge of science, what quantum physics is doing, that, the guys that won the Nobel Prize last year or the year before won it for proving that there's no such thing as localized reality, according to quantum physics. But, Nagarjuna had this really great, to me, like mind-breaking definition of nothingness, of the true nature of everything, in that sort of Buddhist conception. And it was something, this is a bit of a paraphrase, but it's something like true nature, nothingness with a capital N, emptiness, is that which avoids the four propositions, which is to say, one, it's not real. Two, it's not unreal. Three, it's not both real and unreal. And four, it's not neither real nor unreal. Just trying to think through that kind of breaks your mind, which is precisely what it's trying to point towards. Like thisness, this vastness can't be thought, it can't be thought through. And I think that's where, when we get to the idea of superminds, when we get to the idea of ancient gods, when we get to the idea of like vast cosmic otherness, we're in the fear of that. We're in the fear of that idea of something which the human mind can't compute, And the question is really like, are we able to go over the threshold of that into just dissolution into it? It brings us back to that. So I think that the AI mind makes me think of that too, makes me think of this idea that the mind can tip beyond the human boundaries into something else, something intangible and inconceivable for our little brains.
It has me considering too how as long as we can feel as if or maintain some level of control over the monster we created, it's not our monster, right? Even in this, I mean, once it escapes into the fiberglass and the ethernet and otherwise grows and develops upon itself, maybe it does. But I mean, for all the excitement I even felt initially thinking about this thing, knowing that it's something that we can create takes some of that power away from it. I mean, there's plenty of good stories about the thing we create becoming uncreated and monstrous in its own image. Frankenstein probably being one of the original, right, explorations of that. But I'm brought back, and I keep thinking about the sort of non-selfness of nothingness, right? Which is probably the most annihilating and terrible thing for especially the Western mind to have to contend with. And that is such a part of cosmic horror. It's such a part of the suspense, the narrative arc, the pivot, right? Is usually the Western mind not being able to contend with these actually very spiritual, emancipatory tenets or provocations. But is the non-self a requisite for this particular monster, or is it actually is non-self the threat if we are coming up against this particular monster, or is the over attachment to self the threat? Or is that are they mutually exclusive? Like,
yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I think that's a beautiful way of sort of delineating it. And I would say it's the latter. I would say that, if we're talking about cosmic horror, and you're right that, so much of this, for a Western mind, you could say, yes, it's true that no self can seem terrifying because it's the last thing that the self wants. The last thing that the self wants is to die, is to dissolve. But, I mean, one of the things that the kind of these Eastern traditions that we're talking about kind of speaks of is that once that happens, once the separate self, the ego self dissolves, it's then seen that it was never there to begin with. It was always only Brahman. It was always only boundlessness. And B, it's like, in a sense, dying, in that once that happens, there's no one left to mourn its passing. You know what I mean? And so it's that boundary where the self feels that it's going to die, that is really, I think, the home of cosmic horror. And look, that's a fear for everybody. How can it not be? You know, but I think it brings us to that very ancient, edict of, if you die before you die, then when you die, you shall not die. Those words that are written on the temple somewhere in Greece. And I think, this is a very ancient idea that you have to die before you die to really reach true peace, and true emptiness, to reach the peace that passeth understanding. And so I think, yes, the story of the monster is always confronting that, or at least the story of the cosmic monster is about confronting that. So really the problem is not no self. The problem is clinging to self. The problem is the fear, the totally understandable fear of standing at the precipice of the void and not allowing yourself to fall into it. And yes, that is very challenging, but it is also, what people speak about is, once that happens, once you fall into the void, the open secret is there was never anyone there to fall into the void in the first place. There was only this boundlessness, this formlessness in the first place. I guess that's the sort of, the Zen realization, or the Advaitan realization. So, yeah, I think it's the clinging to the self. I mean, in a way, it kind of, what I love about that too, thinking about it in that way, is it kind of it rescues for me, or rescue isn't the right word, but it puts the monster, the cosmic monster, in its right place. The problem isn't the monster. The problem is the person trying to conceive of the monster.
Yeah.
And again, this is a sacred, I often think that when we're speaking of the monster, we're speaking of the realm of the sacred. We're speaking of the gods and the goddesses. And how we relate to the monster is, in a way, how we relate to the sacred, in a strange and twisted way. But there's some truth to that, I think.
Absolutely. I'm curious about when you're going to start launching your microdosing cosmic monsters for moksha workshop that I would love to join, the ways in which to engage cosmic horror for spiritual enlightenment.
Little licks of Cthulhu to get us. Yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to see how that began representation in the tabloids, I think, too. Maybe a little still young in your tenure to become the cult leader we hope to see you as.
I'm hoping, I'm getting there. I'm getting there.
I mean, we barely touched on we have there's so much to touch on. The void being a very hard thing to touch on, because I guess you can't truly touch it anyway. But I do love that you brought up the fact that the void is often actually not a thing, and the person contending with the void being not a thing as well. And there's a book that you have a hand in helping publish, Notes on Nothing, that really, really elegantly, I believe, kind of communicates that in a, it's not as heavy on the explicit cosmic horror, but you can taste it. You can taste it there, sneaking and slithering around all the corners.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, that's true. I am part of a press that's publishing a book called Notes on Nothing. That is, I guess you'd call it an attempt to, speak about nothing, or describe an experience with nothing. To do this impossible thing, which is to speak about what can never be spoken about. But it's an attempt to describe a kind of, I suppose, a no self experience. And I think what it is really is a kind of I think I've come to think of it as a spell that wants to make you disappear for a little while. And maybe if you let it in, it can do that for a little while. But yes, it's really, if people are interested in this subject of nothing with a big N, I think it's a good one to kind of jump into. A very short little book. It's published anonymously, because how can a book about no self have a name on it? But It's one that's coming out. It'll be out in this month, by the end of this month. So people can look it up through As Is Press, which is the name of the press. Notes on Nothing. The Joy of Being Nobody, or The Joy of Being No One is the sub. But yeah, thank you for mentioning that. But yes, I mean that doesn't speak so much about monsters, but you're right. It does, I think, speak about the fear that can come up, the struggles of the self to try and understand its own nothingness. And the other thing that I feel like we haven't spoken about, which is important to say, because I think especially in our culture, the idea of nothingness can be taken in a very negative way. It
Yeah.
can to be a kind of cold, empty, nihilistic, howling wind across the tundra. That's not the kind of nothingness that this kind of tradition and experience speak about, because the great paradox of it, the great dance of it, which is right there in the Heart Sutra, one of the foundational texts of Buddhism. The first line is form is only emptiness, emptiness only form, meaning nothing is everything. Nothing is also everything. The great dance of everything is also nothing appearing as everything, and so that to me is that, when I think of the great dance of the monsters and the gods and goddesses, they're dancing out of this formlessness, this boundlessness. And I think to keep in mind both of those poles, both sides of that dance is so important when we're thinking about these things. And the love of nothingness is also the love of everythingness, if you like.
It goes right back to the thing again, right? Like this
Yeah,
the capacity to be everything and nothing, and the sort
exactly.
of superior, um I don't want to use intelligence because it has too many kind of mundane connotations. The superior consciousness of an entity slash assumption or amalgam of entities that are constantly amassing something while kind of undulating toward this inevitability of nothing, of total hollowness, emptiness. I mean, there's, I will admit that I have not, been inside the thing's head. I should not be speaking on behalf of the thing slash things. But it is the sensation you get even by Carpenter being really clever. I mean, he pulled the story obviously from the short story of the same name, but utilizing that barren landscape of the Arctic, right, where you're already kind of dealing with an abyssal or void like place, somewhere that people aren't supposed to be and they're not supposed to live, right? They're certainly not supposed to thrive, but finding a creature whose ability to be full of nothing and assuming of everything has allowed it to be a preternatural. And we're left to imagine the surviving entity of the continent, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a thing that knows how to. I mean, all it seems it wants to do is to replicate itself, to spread its dance of everything and nothing everywhere that it can. And you're right. Like, I feel like what's so great about the thing is, yeah, the thing itself, the monster, the creature itself is everything and nothing. But also that dance is that polarity is in the fabric of the film. It's
Yeah.
woven into the fabric of the film that we're watching this, even into the kind of the color palette of the film, that it's
Yeah.
blue and pink,
Yeah.
it's like the empty blues and grays of the Arctic and the kind of vivid fleshy pinks and reds of the thing. It's right there in the language of the movie. And that's where I think movies at their best can capture something ineffable in the way that literature can. It's not necessarily through the story, it's in this kind of way in which good films can spill out of the borders of their
Yeah.
own borders. And I think The Thing is one of those, and there are plenty of others too. And we've been speaking, so I mean, we've had such a great conversation that there's a million and one movies we could have spoken about, but I feel like The Thing is a great candidate. how to capture this kind of feeling on celluloid, you know.
Yeah, and that particular the use of the almost an appeal to alien or supernova like, celestial firmamental colors, right? I mean, it's really clear in film like Color Out of Space, which we've also spoken about in previous conversations. But we see a really planted in many ways within the thing too, and they're using whether it's the light of the flare, or something, but they're creating these pinks, these fuchsias. And one of the films I saw recently that did a good job with this, and it was not a film that I expected, like I walked away from it saying that was a really interesting cosmic horror film that I did not expect to be a cosmic horror film, was I saw the TV Glow.
Yeah, I saw that recently too. Yeah, that's a good idea. That's a good reference. Yeah. That there's this sense there of some ineffable reality shimmering through ours, you
Yeah.
know.
There's a weird supernal evil entity, right? Without, because new movie, so I'm trying not to spoil too much.
Yeah.
That there is intense use of color to create a mood, right? And there's I think something that is very, very integral to any kind of cosmic horror, which is a sense of dire loneliness or aloneness, and a sense of extreme distrust of yourself and those around you. That paranoia is like such a key part of the I'm losing myselfness, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's a very good point. And paranoia, of course, all over the thing too. Yeah, the sense of isolation, the sense of, the self contemplating its own erasure in a way is a very
Mm-hmm.
lonely place. And again, it's all about, can you step through the threshold of that into everything?
Yeah.
And I saw the TV Glow has some of that journey in it, although it's kind of, I thought it was really sad at the end in a way,
Yes. Yeah.
the downer ending. But
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
right the idea of color again, I think it points towards like this sort of excess in film that it often is in films that capture the cosmic horror. There's a kind of play between realism and then a kind of excessiveness,
Yeah.
you know, color in effects, I mean, Color Out of Space has that in spades, that's Nick Cage all over the
Yeah.
place. That's Nick Cage's ability to go from a grounded, emotionally complex performance to a completely bonkers, chewing the scenery, and somehow give that a through line,
Yeah.
Uh, he's a perfect choice for a cosmic horror film, I think.
I would argue for any kind of film ever, always give the role to Nicolas Cage. That's how I feel.
Yeah, for any film. Um, but yeah, so I think that's a good example. You know, again, it's interesting that we find the cosmic horror in film in unexpected places, I think. Precisely because it's this unconcretizable, un sort of pin downable thing that films can struggle to, it sort of does it in its tone and in its atmosphere rather than in its structure and in its story, perhaps.
Absolutely. And some of I mean, we could probably talk about this particular type of monster and monstrosity all day, but I want to bring up how your recent work has brought you into this a little bit of a detour from the cosmic and supernatural monster, more in the direction of a human monster. And I was hoping you could speak a little bit about the role the cinematic psychopath or slasher character plays for the same kind of collective imagination and audiences that are affected by and affected and infested by the cosmic horror monster too.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've always, I mean, I don't, what I work, the kind of genres I work in are kind of quite varied. And I've worked in the horror genre and the sort of science fiction and fantasy. But the scripts that kind of first established me as a writer were thrillers, really. They were crime thrillers and kind of psychological thrillers. And I've always loved that genre. And I think what's interesting about, I mean, one way into thinking about the psychopath, which is definitely for me a monster, a great, a seriously monstrous monster, the kind of psychopath figure. But I think what's interesting about the psychopath, in a way, it kind of straddles us into out of the horror genre. There's definitely psychopaths in the horror genre. I mean, you mentioned the sort of slasher movie, and often the kind of antagonist of the slasher movie, the monster, is a sort of
Yeah.
psychopathic sociopath. The Michael Myers type, Jason type, Halloween, Friday the 13th kind of thing. But I think you also find perhaps even more the psychopathic figure, the sociopathic figure in the kind of thriller, right? In the kind of crime thriller, in the psychological thriller. And I think that that kind of monster, I think that's more than just an academic point in a way, because I think that what that monster represents, the psychopath, the human monster, I think what it represents is a step out of, we're saying that the monster is in the realm of the sacred. I wonder if the world of the psychopath is a world in which the sacred has been completely emptied out. I feel
Mm,
the psychopath in a way represents like the primacy of materiality, the primacy, the triumph of the material world. The psychopath is this empty human. It looks like us, it smiles like us, it, charms like us, but it's not us. It's this absent center, in a way, in the spectrum of nothing, from like the big N nothing. To me, the psychopath's right on the other end. It's like nothingness trapped resolutely in the
mm.
material. It's like nothingness bounded by a sort of fake self. And that's what makes it really, really terrifying, because I think the psychopath kind of reminds us, I think, it's like a chaos agent. It reminds us that in a world where there's no gods, where there's nothing but materiality, that's the world where the psychopath rules, because the psychopath is the the kind of chaos agent that can come into our lives, that looks like us and feels like us, but if we let them in, can completely turn everything upside down, can destroy the sort of peaceful order of our lives. It kind of reminds us that in a material world, the boundaries between us, our happy little lives, and total chaos are very thin. And the psychopath can step into that and cause havoc. So I feel like I think that's what the psychopath seems to represent to me. It's like, I mean, you probably have much more, I'm sure you have much more understanding of this kind of symbology than me, but it's what I understand to be the kind of the inversion of the pentacle or pentagram, right? It's like the primacy of the material world over the spiritual world. That to me is what the psychopath is. And that's why I think it's such a scary character, and in its own way unknowable. There's like a kind of mystery at the heart of the psychopath, because anyone who has any empathy and relatedness can't really go there, can't really think into the mind of the psychopath, right, very easily, or perhaps at all. And so it's like, the last thing I would say I've been thinking about is like, it's kind of interesting, I think, to compare the psychopath to the kind of supernatural, like changeling monster, like the thing, or like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, let's say,
Yeah.
like the character, the thing that replaces the human, and it looks like us and talks like us, but it's not us. It's some like intergalactic spore creature.
Yeah.
And I think the difference between the two is like with the supernatural or the extraterrestrial version, it's true that it's not us. It's the fear of like it seems like us, but it's not. But always in those stories, there's kind of an answer, right? There's like an answer to the question, well, what is it then? And so you can, once it's discovered as what it truly is, you can kind of find a way to deal with it. You can find a way to survive it, or you know overcome it. Whereas with the psychopath, you never get, I think, the satisfaction of the answer. You only get more absence. You only get what's missing, this sense of connection, this sense of empathy, this sense of relatedness. So there's this kind of mystery, which is in a way, I suppose you could call it a kind of a little small reflection of the big mystery of the unknowable nothing, but it's this little, almost tawdry version of it trapped within a person, you know? So that's my thought. That's what I've been thinking about the cyber, and that's why it's such a kind of interesting character to write and quite a chilling character to write. I mean, I don't know about you. This brings me on to a subject that I'm kind of interested in, but I feel like when you're writing about monsters, you kind of got to be careful because these things
Yeah.
infect, these things can get to you. And I find working on a psychopathic character probably the most disturbing, because there isn't that bond of affection and love, as I mentioned, that is there with the other
Yeah.
of the monster. It's more like trying to think yourself into this kind of like empty nothingness, this nihilistic nothingness.
I love that as you were sharing all of this, a ice cream truck had parked outside of my apartment, and I just heard the song in the background, which brought to mind films like It, or all these kind of like chilling. There's something that looks like the ice cream man in the ice cream truck, but he's not. Um, I am really, really excited about how you kind of made this foil of the cosmic horror monster and the sort of cinematic psychopath, that where on one hand with the cosmic horror monster, this non-selfness is so integral. It's not even I mean, I think to the mind that is beleaguered with selfness, it's very violent, right? But I don't actually think the cosmic horror's involvement with nothingness is ever an intentional violence, right? It is violence because of our response to a thing. Where with this psychopath, we're working with an anti-self, right? Like it's so it feels like something that is a resistance or a rebellion against the cultivation of self, to the point where it might almost be like a hyper cultivation of the material or performative self. Patrick Bateman really comes to mind as a great example of what you were talking about, right? That kind of quintessential, all the best skin routine, perfectly dressed, all the hiding in plain sightness. But I think where say the body snatcher, like doppelganger figure, it becomes challenging, is the uncanniness. We can tell there's something that isn't human there, right? We can feel it, the way it looks, the way it doesn't or doesn't respond.
Yeah,
And the cinematic psychopath, for the most part, is, I mean, I think about also characters like Moriarty from Sherlock Holmes as well, is so smart and so charming and so not all of them obviously, but a lot of them rely on being able to have that kind of charismatic influence, right?
absolutely. Yeah, I love what you're saying. You're right, because the doppelganger, the supernatural or extraterrestrial doppelganger, there's always a tell,
Yeah,
stiff little finger in from the invaders.
yeah.
It's the sort of weird affect. The psychopath often doesn't have any of that. In fact, the psychopath can be incredibly alluring. It's just that what happens what you slowly realize with the psychopath is everything has just been reduced to the same sort of material neutrality, you know. But even their charm and affect is based on nothing, on an absence. And so, I mean, one of the things I was reading recently, an actual paper about real psychopaths, people who'd been diagnosed as psychopathic or antisocial personality disorder in prisons,
Mm.
and they asked a series of moral questions. And what was really interesting is, if you ask these psychopaths, is killing wrong, for example, they would all say, yeah, killing is wrong. But so they would give the kind of morally correct answer, if you like. But underneath that was, the researchers realized that it was just as wrong to a psychopath. Killing someone was just equally as wrong to a psychopath as running a red light.
Yeah,
The only reason why it's wrong is because there's a law that says it's wrong.
yeah.
No internal kind of structure of relating that tells them, there's no conscience, if you like, that tells them that it's no, there's something that a human must recoil from in the idea of killing somebody. So I feel like, yeah, that's Patrick Bateman. That's the brilliant thing about American Psycho, the book and the film. I think the film did a good job in that everything is reduced, like whether it's a, Huey Lewis and the News album, being kind of lovingly dissected, or if it's like someone literally, a human being literally dissected, it's the same thing. It's on the same level. That's what makes it so, I think, chilling. But it's like you said, it's within a human. This is within the structure of a human being. This is that we don't have the kind of the what's the word? We don't have the satisfaction or the comfort of being able to say, oh, well, it's just because it's a spore being from another galaxy.
Yeah. Yeah, you're
Um,
like, that doesn't make me feel any better to know that there's a spore being from another galaxy, but at least I can say, oh, well, that's because it's a spore being from another
exactly.
reality.
Oh, I get it. It's a spore being.
Not like I could have a child who would become Hannibal Lecter, right?
And that is the another part of the terror of the psychopath that I was speaking actually to a friend of mine who's a psychotherapist, and he was saying the thing about psychopaths is it's like every so often a child is born that is just completely unrelated to anyone around them. That's the feeling of a psycho. They are truly alone. They truly exist in their own category. And it could be, it could be someone in your family, it could be your neighbor, it could be, and it probably is. So
Yeah.
I think that to me is the fear, the monstrousness of the psychopath, and the difference of the psychopath from the sort of supernatural monster. You know, we're talking about a very material world when we're talking about the psychopath.
What do you think the future of this kind of cinematic psychopath is? Like, is there a way or ways in which it can grow like alongside us to remain the sort of horrifying predator that deserves our immortal fascination?
I mean, look, I feel like the question of what is the future of these kind of these sort of fictional entities, or let's say, not you, I mean, let's just call them, in a way, I think the psychopath is an archetype, is a kind of transpersonal figure that's
Yeah.
probably in different forms through history. And my feeling with all of those, whether it's a cosmic tentacular creature, or whether it's a vampire or a werewolf, or whether it's a psychopath, my feeling is that their stories will always want to be told.
Mm.
That it's not necessarily about um, evolving the archetype. It's just we will just inevitably find different ways in which to tell their stories because their stories will always want to be told. That's
Yeah.
really the yeah. I think as someone who works within genres and who loves the constraints of genres and loves the satisfactions and the joys and the pleasures of genre storytelling, my feeling is it's what it's always been, which is there's good genre storytelling and then
Yeah.
there's easy bad genre storytelling. And the good stuff is always, I think, about coming at it with a certain authenticity and a certain kind of tonal understanding and a certain, a new sensibility. But the stories are the stories. The stories will always want to be told. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And look, I mean, I saw the TV Glow as a great example of a story that's talking that using, for example, the cosmic horror archetype in an interesting way, in an unexpected way. And these stories will always happen, and the psychopath will always recur through stories. And our job is just to tell the stories in the best way that we can, I think. And a bad genre film, I think, or a bad genre story is always one in which there's no life behind the structure. There's no injection of pleasure behind the structure. It's just painting by numbers. And
Yeah.
that's always been something that I feel like as creators we need to try and avoid as best we
Yeah.
can.
I really appreciate this being that it is not the monsters that need to grow and change. It is not the stories that need to grow and change. It is that we must be consistently loyal, good, devoted and, fastidious stewards of those stories.
Beautifully said. And if we're saying that what we're doing is translating their reality into ours, all we can work on is our skills
Yeah.
as translators, our instincts and our skills and our facilities as good translators. And that's where I think our job lies, as creators, and as tellers of these stories. Absolutely. It reminds me of, I was reading recently, there's a British mystic called Peter Kingsley, who's kind of interesting guy. He's written a lot about Jung, but he's also written a lot about the kind of birth of civilization, of Western civilization, kind of pre-Socratic birth of Western civilization. And, it's not by any means his idea or a new idea, but he sort of is very good about how perhaps if we've made a wrong turn in Western culture, it's that the spiritual question, if we ask one, has often become, what can God or the gods do for me? What can the
Mm.
gods do? And he's very good at sort of showing that isn't the question that we started off with. That isn't the question at the sort of cradle of our civilization. The question that we started off with some thousands of years ago was, what can we do for the gods? How can we serve the gods and the goddesses? And for someone like Peter Kingsley, that shift from how can we serve the gods to how can the gods serve us is really the problem. Is the problem that we've got ourselves into. And when I read this, I did feel like, well, that's kind of what we're doing. We're asking that first original primordial question in a way when we're writing these stories. Like, how can we serve
Yeah.
these whatever we want to call them, these forces, these entities, these kind of transpersonal beings? It's a good question to ask, I think, for any creator.
And it's the first true way to approach relationship building, period, right? And that shouldn't just be limited to the people around us, but of course the stories and the characters that we wish to be in relationship with too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's once again, it's escaping the tyranny of our little ego.
Yeah. Yeah, and the expectation of transaction at that point. It's another thing that we are not
And that's again escaping the material world of the psychopath. It's all transactional. It's all about what can the world do for me in that space. And our job is to escape that space, I think.
so by heeding the call of Cthulhu and joining his non-Euclidean geometric temples and spaces, you actually stray further away from the path of the psychopath. You heard it here. You heard it here.
Exactly. Yeah. Worship those monsters.
Yes. You have been so generous with your time, but I have one more question I have to ask you, which
Yeah.
is, if you were trapped in a room and told that your only means of escape is through confronting one of two monsters, the supernatural monster or the human monster, which one do you choose?
I love that question because because the surface answer, the kind of immediate answer seems obvious, which is like, well, I wouldn't really want to be trapped in the room with like a xenomorph or a
Yeah.
rabid werewolf or something, something with so much power that could tear me apart. But of course, as we've been saying, when you're in the realm of like the sacred and the gods and goddesses and the non-ordinary, there's always kind of like I feel like there's always a key to understanding that monster. There's like, if you can figure out what the monster wants and how to feed it, and this is another thing we could talk about,
Oh
but
my
the
God, yeah.
idea of feeding your demons, the idea of
Yeah.
chud that you introduced me to. But if you understand the monster, if you understand its logic, if you understand its rules, you can kind of overcome it. If you have the amulet, if you have the spell, if you have the kind of, if you know the weakness, you can find a way to neutralize it, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you're trapped in a room with a human monster, like a psychopath, like I said, you're not in the realm of you're in the realm of the material world where chaos can erupt. They have chaos on their side, and so it's a fight for your life if you don't know if you know,
Yeah.
and there's no key, I don't think, or the key is much harder to find. So I don't know. I'll always want to hang out with a monster, with a supernatural monster. Give me a banshee any day over a psychopath.
It's the best answer because even if you're gonna die kind of either way, at least
Yeah,
you get to die in, the mouth of God as opposed to
yeah,
at the hands of Patrick Bateman.
exactly. Way better than, listening to Huey Lewis in the news and yeah, getting axed by Patrick Bateman.
Talk about a road to non-self. Talk about a different way to losing your mind.
Exactly. Exactly. The most tawdry way.
Yeah. Jay, this has been an absolute pleasure beyond what I could have even imagined. Thank you for being so generous with your time. I know that you have a really, really busy schedule of writing this month, so it means the most to me.
Oh, it was so much fun. Thank you so much. I love talking about this stuff. Thank
I
you, Sarah.
will I will invite you back soon so that we can just
Good.
maybe talk about the thing for an hour straight.
Let's do it. Pure carpenter.
Yeah, undilute, uncut.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. You have a